Zektar stood on the command deck of the massive warship called Eternal Dominion and watched the small human vessel drift through space near the giant planet Jupiter. His forearms moved across the control panels with practiced ease while his three eyes focused on the readings that appeared on the screens before him. The human ship looked tiny compared to his own vessel and seemed to pose no threat at all to anyone for 20 cycles. Zektar had served the Vorthik Empire as a war commander and had seen 17 different star systems fall before their mighty fleet. Every species they encountered followed the same pattern when faced with Vorthik power. First came fear, then desperate attempts at negotiation, then finally complete surrender. When they realized how hopeless their situation had become, the human research vessel called New Horizon appeared to be conducting some kind of scientific work around the moons of Jupiter. Zektar had studied the basic information about humans that their scouts had gathered over the past few months. They were a young species that had only recently developed space travel and had established small colonies throughout their solar system. According to the reports, humans were physically weak compared to most galactic species and relied heavily on primitive technology to survive in space. Their weapons seemed basic and their military appeared to be scattered across multiple small units rather than organized into proper battle fleets. Everything suggested that conquering them would be as simple as all the previous campaigns. Zektar activated the communication system and sent a standard surrender demand to the human vessel. The message was clear and direct as always. The humans had exactly one standard time unit to prepare for boarding and complete submission to Vorthik authority. Any resistance would result in the immediate destruction of their ship and the death of everyone aboard. The response came back within minutes and surprised Zektar more than he cared to admit. Instead of panic or immediate surrender, the human captain had politely requested additional time to consider the terms. The voice belonged to someone called Captain Lisa Carter, who spoke in calm, measured tones as if discussing routine business rather than facing potential death. This had never happened before in any of Zektar's previous conquests. Other species either surrendered immediately when faced with overwhelming odds or launched hopeless attacks that ended in quick defeat. No one had ever asked for time to think about surrender. Zektar found himself curious about this unusual response and decided to grant the request. He gave the humans exactly 2 more time units to make their decision while keeping his weapons trained on their vessel. During this waiting period, he observed their ship more carefully and noticed something strange about their behavior. The humans were not acting like other species had when faced with Vorthik demands. There was no obvious panic or desperate activity visible through their ship's viewports. Instead, the crew seemed to be going about their normal duties with unusual calm. Some were even gathered around what appeared to be research equipment, completely ignoring the massive warship that could destroy them at any moment. Zektar watched as a human wearing what looked like an engineering uniform moved between different stations on their ship. This person seemed to be making modifications to various systems, but showed no signs of stress or fear. Another human appeared to be continuing some kind of scientific analysis as if nothing unusual was happening. The strangest thing was that several humans could be seen through the viewport, and they appeared to be smiling. Zektar had never seen conquered prey smile when facing death. Usually there were tears or expressions of terror or desperate attempts to hide from the inevitable. But these humans looked almost amused by the situation. As the time limit approached, Zektar received reports from his sensor operators that the human ship had transmitted several messages toward the inner parts of their solar system. The transmissions were brief and used simple codes that the Vorthik systems could easily intercept and decode. The messages appeared to contain the location of the human ship and basic information about the Vorthik vessel. This behavior also seemed strange to Zektar. Most species tried to hide their locations when under attack or attempted to send desperate pleas for help that would never arrive in time. But the humans had simply transmitted factual information about their situation without any obvious emotional content. When the deadline arrived, Captain Lisa Carter responded with another polite message. She thanked Zektar for the additional time and regretfully declined the surrender offer. Her tone remained calm and professional throughout the communication. She explained that her crew had voted on the matter and decided they preferred to remain independent. Ze Kadar stared at the communication screen in complete bewilderment. In 20 cycles of conquest, he had never encountered anything like this response. The humans were outnumbered by thousands to one and outgunned by weapons they could not possibly understand or counter. Yet they were declining surrender as if they had other options available. The most disturbing part was that Captain Carter had ended her message by wishing Zektar and his crew good luck in the coming battle. No conquered species had ever wished their attackers good luck before. The entire situation felt wrong in ways that Zektar could not properly identify or explain as he prepared to give the order to attack. Zektar noticed that the humans on the research vessel were still smiling. Some were even laughing as they moved around their ship making final preparations. It was as if they knew something that he did not, and that knowledge filled them with confidence instead of fear. For the first time in his long military career, Zektar felt a small flutter of uncertainty in his chest. Something about these humans was different from every other species the Vorthok had encountered, but he pushed the feeling aside and prepared to discover what made them think they could survive what was about to happen. Zektar gave the attack order and watched his weapons officer target the small human research vessel with enough firepower to vaporize a small moon. The energy beam struck the human ship, and Zektar expected to see it break apart in brilliant flashes of destruction. Instead, something impossible happened that made his three eyes widen in shock. The human vessel absorbed the attack without taking any visible damage. Bright energy shields flared around the ship, revealing defensive systems that should not have existed on a simple research craft. The readings on Zektar's screens showed power levels that were far beyond what their intelligence reports had suggested humans possessed. Before Zektar could process what he was seeing, the human ship began to transform. Panels slid away to reveal weapon ports that had been hidden beneath the innocent-looking research equipment. The vessel that had appeared helpless and vulnerable moments before suddenly bristled with military hardware that seemed to appear from nowhere. Captain Lisa Carter's voice came across the communication channel again, but now it carried a different tone entirely. She identified herself as Commander Carter of the Human Defense Corps and explained that the New Horizon was actually a reconnaissance vessel disguised as a research ship. Her crew had been waiting for exactly this kind of encounter. The humans aboard the ship moved with military precision that had been completely hidden during their earlier interactions. The person Zektar had seen working on engineering systems was actually Lieutenant Commander Jake Murphy, who had been preparing battle modifications to their weapons. The scientist who had continued her research was Dr. Amy Brooks, who had been analyzing Vorthok technology from their previous encounters. Within moments, the human ship launched an attack that caught Zektar's fleet completely off guard. Strange. Weapons that seemed to bend electromagnetic energy struck two of his fighter craft and sent them spinning helplessly through space. The weapons had been built from what appeared to be standard research equipment, but had been modified in ways that Vorthok science could not immediately understand. Zektar ordered his remaining fighters to concentrate their attack on the human vessel, but before they could coordinate properly, more ships appeared on his sensors. Human reinforcements had arrived exactly where and when they were needed most. The timing was too perfect to be a coincidence, and Zektar realized that the humans had planned this encounter from the beginning. The new arrivals were led by a warship called Intrepid under the command of Admiral Kate Johnson. Her fleet was much smaller than Zektar's force and should have been overwhelmed within minutes of arriving. But the human ships moved in patterns that seemed to defy basic military logic, while somehow achieving tactical advantages that should have been impossible. Instead of maintaining safe distances and using long-range weapons, the human ships closed to point-blank range where their inferior firepower could be used more effectively. Several human vessels deliberately rammed into Vorthok fighters in coordinated attacks that destroyed both ships but eliminated key enemy units at critical moments. Zektar watched in growing horror as Lieutenant Ryan Parker led a squadron of human fighters in what could only be described as controlled suicide attacks. The human pilots deliberately damaged their own ships to create improvised missiles that caused far more destruction than their normal weapons could have achieved. They laughed and cheered over the communication channels as they died. This kind of behavior was completely outside Zektar's understanding of how military forces operated. Soldiers were supposed to preserve their lives and equipment while achieving their objectives. They were not supposed to throw themselves into certain death with expressions of joy on their faces. The battle continued to develop in ways that violated everything Zektar thought he knew about space combat. Human ships that should have retreated, when damaged, instead pressed their attacks even more aggressively. Crews that should have abandoned heavily damaged vessels stayed at their posts and continued fighting until their ships were completely destroyed. Engineer Tony Martinez somehow managed to jury-rig weapon systems that created new types of electromagnetic pulses during the middle of combat. His innovations spread throughout the human fleet within minutes as other ships copied his modifications and improved upon them in real time. The humans were literally inventing new weapons during the battle. Admiral Kate Johnson coordinated her forces with a combination of careful planning and inspired improvisation that kept Zektar's larger fleet off balance throughout the engagement. Every time the Vorthak adapted to human tactics, the humans changed their approach and found new ways to exploit weaknesses that had not existed moments before. The most disturbing aspect of the human fighting style was how they seemed to treat the entire battle as a learning experience. Every ship that was destroyed transmitted detailed information about Vorthak capabilities to the surviving vessels. Every failed attack provided data that improved the success of subsequent attempts. Zektar realized that the humans were not just fighting to win this particular battle. They were fighting to gather intelligence that would help them win future battles against the Vorthak Empire. Every human death was simultaneously a tactical loss and a strategic gain that made their species more dangerous. Commander Carter's ship continued to serve as the center of human operations, while Dr. Amy Brooks analyzed captured Vorthak equipment in real time. Her scientific background allowed her to identify weaknesses in Vorthak technology that military officers might have missed. She transmitted her findings to all human vessels and their weapons immediately, adapted to exploit the newly discovered vulnerabilities. The tide of battle began to shift as human ships concentrated their fire on specific points that Dr. Brooks had identified as critical weaknesses. Vorthak vessels that had seemed invulnerable minutes earlier began to suffer system failures and hull breaches that should not have been possible. Zektar found himself facing a tactical nightmare that grew worse with every passing moment. The humans had turned what should have been a simple conquest into a complex multi-layered battle that challenged every assumption about how space warfare was supposed to work. His fleet was larger and more powerful than the human force, but the humans were using advantages that Zektar had never encountered before. They possessed flexibility that allowed them to change their entire strategy within minutes. They demonstrated innovation that created new solutions to tactical problems on demand. Most importantly, they showed a willingness to accept losses that would have broken the morale of any other species. As more human ships arrived to join the battle, Zektar began to understand that he was not facing a simple military engagement. He was facing a species that had evolved to fight in ways that other civilizations could not comprehend or counter. The humans were not just warriors. They were something far more dangerous than anything the Vorthak Empire had previously encountered in their campaigns of conquest. The battle escalated beyond anything Zektar had experienced in his long military career when more human reinforcements arrived from the direction of Mars. These new ships brought ground assault teams that immediately began launching boarding pods toward Vorthak vessels. Zektar watched in disbelief as humans in simple spacesuits used magnetic boots and portable oxygen tanks to cross the vacuum between ships. Colonel Sam Davis led the first boarding team that somehow managed to breach the hull of a Vorthak cruiser, using nothing more than shaped explosive charges and personal cutting tools. His soldiers fought their way through corridors designed for beings twice their size while carrying weapons that seemed primitive compared to Vorthak technology. Yet somehow they were winning. The humans moved through Vorthic ships like a plague that spread from section to section. They used their smaller size to crawl through maintenance tunnels and ventilation systems that Vorthic warriors could not access. They set traps in corridors and used the ship's own systems against the crews who had built them. Zektar received panicked reports from ship commanders throughout his fleet describing human boarding parties that seemed to appear everywhere at once. The humans had somehow learned the layout of Vorthic vessels and knew exactly where to strike to cause maximum damage with minimum effort. They targeted life support systems, power generators, and computer cores with surgical precision. The most terrifying report came from the cruiser domination, where a single human called Sergeant Mary Cole had barricaded herself in a critical junction and was holding off an entire squad of Vorthic Marines. She had constructed improvised explosives from maintenance supplies and was using them to collapse sections of corridor behind her as she slowly retreated toward the ship's reactor core. Zektar listened to the communication channels as Mary Cole taunted the Vorthic warriors pursuing her. She explained in detail how she planned to overload their reactor and turn their own ship into a weapon against the rest of the fleet. Her voice remained calm and professional even as energy weapons fire could be heard in the background. The Vorthic Marines finally cornered Sergeant Cole in the reactor chamber where she had spent her final minutes rigging the power systems to explode. She died fighting 12 warriors simultaneously while armed with nothing but a sidearm and her bare hands. But her sacrifice eliminated not just her immediate opponents, but the entire ship when the reactor core breached exactly as she had planned. Meanwhile, Dr. Amy Brooks continued her analysis of Vorthic technology from aboard the New Horizon. She had somehow managed to access the computer systems of damaged enemy vessels and was downloading their technical databases in real time. Every piece of information she gathered was immediately transmitted to human ships throughout the battle zone. The effects of Dr. Brooks' intelligence work became apparent when human weapons began targeting specific components that had been completely protected minutes earlier. She had identified weaknesses in Vorthic shield generators that allowed human energy weapons to penetrate defenses that should have been impregnable. Her scientific knowledge was being applied to military problems with devastating effectiveness. What disturbed Zektar most was how quickly the humans adapted to new situations during combat. When their long-range weapons proved ineffective, they switched to boarding actions without hesitation. When boarding actions became too costly, they developed new tactics that combined both approaches in ways that multiplied their effectiveness. Lieutenant Commander Jake Murphy demonstrated this adaptability by coordinating simultaneous attacks that struck Vorthic vessels from multiple directions at once. His boarding teams would breach a ship's hull while other human vessels targeted the same ship with precisely timed weapon strikes. The combination of internal sabotage and external bombardment proved impossible for Vorthic crews to counter. The humans also began using psychological warfare that was more effective than any weapon in the Vorthic arsenal. They broadcast recordings of their successful boarding actions across all communication frequencies so that every Vorthic warrior could hear exactly what was happening to their comrades. The sounds of human laughter mixed with Vorthic death screams created a terror that spread throughout the enemy fleet. Tony Martinez continued his engineering innovations by developing new types of electromagnetic weapons that could disable Vorthic systems without destroying them completely. This allowed human boarding teams to capture enemy vessels intact and turn their own weapons against the rest of the fleet. Several Vorthic ships found themselves under attack by their own sister vessels that had been captured and converted by human crews. The tactical flexibility that humans displayed seemed to have no limits. When conventional boarding actions proved too dangerous, they began using their damaged ships as guided missiles that could penetrate deep into Vorthic formations. When energy weapons were insufficient, they switched to kinetic projectiles that could punch through any known armor. When direct attacks failed, they used stealth and deception to achieve their objectives. Through indirect means, Zektar realized that the humans were not following any recognizable military doctrine. Instead, they were improvising solutions to tactical problems as they encountered them. Every challenge became an opportunity to develop new approaches that other species would never have considered possible. The most horrifying aspect of human tactics was their willingness to sacrifice individual units to achieve strategic advantages. They would deliberately expose small groups of ships to overwhelming enemy fire in order to gather intelligence about Vorthak capabilities. The crews of these vessels knew they were going to die, but they transmitted detailed sensor data until the moment their ships were destroyed. Admiral Kate Johnson coordinated these sacrificial attacks with cold precision that impressed even Zektar despite his growing fear of human capabilities. She treated the loss of ships and crews as necessary investments that would pay dividends in future engagements. Her strategic thinking operated on timescales that extended far beyond the current battle. As the engagement continued, Zektar began to understand that humans approached warfare as a species-wide learning experience. Every battle taught them new lessons that were immediately shared across their entire military structure. Every defeat made them more dangerous in subsequent encounters. Every victory provided new techniques that could be applied in different situations. The Vorthak Empire had conquered 17 star systems by using overwhelming force against species that fought according to predictable patterns. But humans did not follow patterns. They created new approaches to military problems. Faster than their enemies could adapt, they turned every weakness into a strength and every defeat into a lesson that made them more formidable. By the time Colonel Sam Davis successfully planted explosives in the engine core of another Vorthak cruiser, Zektar had begun to suspect that his empire had encountered something unprecedented in galactic history. The humans were not just another species to be conquered. They were evolutionary survivors who had learned to treat warfare as an art form that could be perfected through constant practice and innovation. The situation became truly terrifying for Zektar when long-range sensors detected the approach of a massive, human battle fleet led by a commander whose reputation preceded him across the galaxy. General Paulstone was known throughout human space as the finisher because he never left an enemy capable of launching future attacks against human interests. Unlike other human commanders who seemed to rely on improvisation and tactical flexibility, General Stone brought something far worse to the battlefield. He brought the systematic approach of someone who had studied warfare for decades and had developed methods for completely destroying enemy civilizations rather than simply defeating their military forces. The human reinforcements that arrived under General Stone's command were different from the earlier vessels that Zektar had been fighting. These ships moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, and their crews communicated using codes that had been perfected through countless previous engagements. They were not learning how to fight during this battle, because they had already mastered every technique they needed. Zektar received intelligence reports about General Stone's previous campaigns that filled him with a dread he had never experienced before. The human commander did not simply conquer enemy territories. He eliminated the possibility that conquered species could ever pose a threat to humanity again. His methods were thorough, efficient, and completely merciless when applied to species that had threatened human civilians. The psychological warfare that humans had been using throughout the battle intensified dramatically when General Stone's forces joined the engagement. They began broadcasting detailed accounts of human military history across all Vorthak communication channels. The recordings described conflicts that had raged across Earth for thousands of years and demonstrated the lengths that humans would go to when fighting for their survival. Dr. Amy Brooks contributed to this psychological assault by providing scientific analysis of human warfare capabilities. Her voice remained calm and professional as she explained how humans had evolved on a planet where everything tried to kill them on a daily basis. She described the development of human weapons technology and the tactical innovations that had allowed them to dominate their homeworld. The most disturbing broadcasts featured testimonials from species that the Vorthak had previously conquered. Human intelligence services had somehow contacted survivors from 17 different star systems and recorded their accounts of Vorthak occupation policies. These voices spoke of families destroyed and civilizations reduced to slavery under the Vorthak Empire. Lieutenant Commander Ben Clark led a desperate mission that demonstrated the true horror of human determination when faced with genocide. His team volunteered for a suicide attack against the Vorthak flagship, knowing that success would require them to manually detonate explosives inside the enemy vessel's reactor core. Zektar watched helplessly as Clark's boarding team fought their way through deck after deck of his flagship while carrying enough explosives to destroy half the Vorthak fleet. The humans moved with the calm efficiency of people who had accepted death as the price of victory. They sang songs from their homeworld as they planted charges in critical locations throughout the ship. The explosion that followed exceeded even Zektar's worst expectations. Ben Clark had not simply destroyed the Vorthak flagship. His team had triggered a chain reaction that spread through the quantum field generators and created a cascade failure that crippled every major vessel in the Vorthak battle fleet. The humans had turned their sacrifice into a weapon of mass destruction. In the aftermath of the flagship's destruction, General Stone demonstrated why he was called the Finisher. Instead of accepting the surrender offers that began flooding human communication channels, he continued the systematic destruction of every Vorthak vessel that remained combat capable. His forces showed no mercy to enemies who had threatened civilian populations. Captain Lisa Carter revealed another aspect of human warfare capabilities when she began coordinating rescue operations for Vorthak crew members who were abandoning their damaged ships. The humans saved enemy lives with the same efficiency they had used to destroy enemy vessels. But the rescued Vorthak were not treated as prisoners of war. They were treated as witnesses who would carry a message back to their empire. The message was simple and terrifying in its clarity. Humanity would not tolerate threats against their civilian populations. Any species that attacked human colonies or enslaved other civilizations would face complete destruction. There would be no negotiations, no mercy, and no possibility of survival. For aggressors who crossed that line, Admiral Kate Johnson explained human strategic doctrine to the captured Vorthak officers with the same professional tone that Dr. Brooks had used to analyze their technology. Humanity had learned from thousands of years of warfare on Earth that the only way to ensure long-term peace was to make the cost of aggression so high that no rational enemy would consider paying it. The humans had not simply defeated the Vorthak fleet in this engagement. They had demonstrated capabilities that would serve as a warning to every potential enemy throughout the galaxy. Species that might have considered attacking human territory would now understand exactly what such attacks would cost them. Tony Martinez provided a practical demonstration of human technological capabilities by showing the captured Vorthak how quickly humans could adapt enemy weapons for their own use. Within hours of capturing Vorthak equipment, human engineers had reverse-engineered the technology and begun producing improved versions that were more effective than the original designs. General Stone's final demonstration involved something that Zektar found more terrifying than any weapon. The human commander offered safe passage to any Vorthak vessel that agreed to carry a complete record of this battle back to the Empire. The survivors would serve as messengers who would ensure that every Vorthak citizen understood the consequences of threatening humanity. This was not the behavior of conquerors who wanted to expand their territory. This was the behavior of survivors who wanted to ensure that they would never again face existential threats. The humans were not interested in ruling over other species. They were interested in making certain that other species would never consider threatening them. As Zektar's own ship was surrounded by human vessels, he realized that his empire had encountered something unprecedented in galactic history. Humanity was not just another spacefaring civilization. They were evolutionary survivors who had learned to approach warfare as a means of ensuring species-wide survival rather than territorial expansion. The horror was not that humans were effective warriors. The horror was that they were warriors who had learned to think and plan and coordinate on a civilizational scale. They did not fight as individuals or even as military units. They fought as an entire species that had dedicated itself to the art of survival in a hostile universe. The message that General Stone wanted carried back to Vorthek space was not a threat or a demand for surrender. It was a simple statement of fact. Humanity had claimed the right to exist in this galaxy, and they possessed the capability to defend that right against any enemy foolish enough to challenge it. The remnants of the Vorthak fleet attempted to retreat from the battle zone, but Captain Lisa Carter had anticipated this move and positioned human ships to block every possible escape route. Her strategic planning demonstrated the same thoroughness that had characterized human tactics throughout the entire engagement. The Vorthek were trapped in a carefully constructed net that had been woven around them while they were focused on the immediate fighting. Zektar realized that the humans had been planning this encounter for much longer than he had initially suspected. Every aspect of the battle, from the initial contact to the current situation, had been orchestrated to achieve specific strategic objectives. The humans had not simply responded to Vorthek aggression. They had manipulated the Vorthek into a situation where human capabilities could be demonstrated with maximum psychological impact. Admiral Kate Johnson opened communication channels to all surviving Vorthek vessels and presented them with a choice that was designed to break their will to fight rather than simply defeat their immediate military forces. The Vorthak could surrender completely and accept human protection, or they could continue fighting until every ship in their fleet was destroyed. There would be no middle ground and no opportunity to regroup for future attacks. The psychological pressure of this ultimatum was amplified by broadcasts from representatives of the 17 species that the Vorthak had conquered during their expansion. These voices spoke directly to Vorthak crews and described the liberation that human forces had brought to their homeworlds. The conquered peoples were no longer slaves because humanity had arrived to enforce galactic justice. Dr. Amy Brooks contributed to this psychological warfare by broadcasting detailed analyses of Vorthak expansion policies and their long-term effects on galactic civilization. Her scientific approach to documenting war crimes made the moral case against the Vorthak Empire more compelling than any emotional appeal could have achieved. She presented evidence that the Vorthak had committed genocide against multiple species. The effect on Vorthak morale was immediate and devastating. Ship after ship began broadcasting surrender signals as crews realized that they were not fighting for conquest or glory. They were fighting to preserve a system that had made them enemies of every decent species in the galaxy. The humans had not simply defeated them militarily. They had exposed the moral bankruptcy of everything the Vorthak Empire represented. Zektar watched his own crew begin to question orders for the first time in their military careers. The warriors who had served the Empire without doubt for decades were now asking whether their cause was worth dying for. The humans had accomplished something that no previous enemy had managed. They had broken the ideological foundation that held the Vorthak military together. Tony Martinez demonstrated human concepts of mercy by allowing Vorthak escape pods to reach nearby planets, but only after their weapons and communication systems had been permanently disabled. The survivors would live, but they would never again possess the capability to threaten anyone. This selective mercy was more terrifying than outright destruction because it showed that humans could choose when to kill and when to spare their enemies. General Stone reinforced this psychological impact by broadcasting recordings of human children learning about galactic history in their schools. The recordings showed young humans studying the fate of aggressive species that had threatened peaceful civilizations. The children discussed these historical examples with the casual confidence of a species that had never doubted their ability to defend themselves. The most disturbing aspect of these broadcasts was how they revealed human attitudes toward warfare and survival. The children spoke of military conflicts as learning experiences that taught valuable lessons about the importance of strength and preparedness. They viewed the destruction of aggressive empires as necessary steps in the evolution of galactic civilization. Lieutenant Commander Jake Murphy coordinated the systematic capture of Vorthak vessels that had chosen surrender over destruction. The human boarding teams that took control of these ships showed the same professional efficiency they had demonstrated during combat operations. But now they were preserving enemy lives and equipment rather than destroying them. The captured Vorthak were not treated as prisoners in the traditional sense. Instead, they were given detailed briefings about human history and strategic doctrine. They were shown recordings of Earth's development and the challenges that had shaped human civilization. They were taught to understand exactly why humanity approached warfare with such systematic thoroughness. Captain Carter explained that the human goal was not to create an empire based on conquest and subjugation. Humanity wanted to create a galactic civilization based on cooperation and mutual defense against aggressive species. The Vorthak could choose to be part of this new order, or they could choose to be eliminated as a threat to peaceful development. Admiral Johnson demonstrated the reach of human intelligence networks by revealing detailed knowledge of Vorthak society and military capabilities. Human agents had been operating throughout Vorthak space for years, gathering information and preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation. The humans had known about Vorthak expansion plans before the Vorthak leadership had finalized them. The revelation that humanity possessed this level of intelligence penetration throughout the galaxy was perhaps more terrifying than their military capabilities. It meant that no species could plan aggressive actions without human knowledge. It meant that humanity had positioned itself as the guardian of galactic peace whether other species wanted that protection or not. Dr. Brooks provided the final piece of the psychological puzzle by explaining how human defensive strategies were designed to prevent future conflicts rather than simply win current battles. Every demonstration of human capability was calculated to discourage potential enemies from considering aggressive actions. The goal was to make warfare so costly that no rational species would choose to engage in it. As more Vorthak ships surrendered, Zektar began to understand that his empire had not simply lost a battle. The Vorthak had encountered a species that possessed the capability and determination to reshape galactic civilization according to human concepts of justice and order. The age of conquest and empire building had ended because humanity had developed the power to enforce peace. The choice that Admiral Johnson had presented to the Vorthak was not really a choice at all. It was an ultimatum that applied to every species in the galaxy. Civilizations could choose to coexist peacefully under human protection, or they could choose to face the same fate that the Vorthak fleet was experiencing. There would be no third option because humanity had the power to enforce these terms. Zektar realized that the galaxy had just witnessed the emergence of a new dominant species. But unlike previous dominant species, humanity was not interested in ruling over others. They were interested in ensuring that no species would ever again face the kind of aggression that the Vorthak had represented. The humans had appointed themselves as the guardians of galactic peace, and they possessed the power to fulfill that role. In the aftermath of the battle, Zektar found himself aboard the human flagship, intrepid as a prisoner under Admiral Kate Johnson's personal custody. But instead of the torture or execution he expected, he received medical treatment for his injuries, and food that had been prepared according to Vorthak dietary requirements. The humans treated their defeated enemies with the same systematic thoroughness they had demonstrated during combat. Dr. Amy Brooks interviewed Zektar extensively, but her questions were not focused on military intelligence or strategic information. Instead, she wanted to understand Vorthak culture and psychology. She studied his species with the same scientific curiosity she had shown when analyzing Vorthak technology. Her goal was knowledge rather than exploitation. The revelation of human motivations came gradually through conversations with various crew members who had participated in the battle. Colonel Sam Davis explained that humans had not developed their military capabilities through choice, but through necessity. Their homeworld Earth was what other species would consider a death world where survival required constant adaptation to hostile conditions. Captain Lisa Carter showed Zektar recordings of human history that documented thousands of years of warfare and environmental challenges that had shaped their evolution. Humans have faced ice ages, volcanic eruptions, asteroid impacts, and climate changes that would have destroyed most other species. They had learned to survive conditions that other civilizations could not even imagine. The most disturbing revelation came when Zektar asked why humans fought with such ferocious determination. The answer provided by various crew members painted a picture of a species that had evolved to treat warfare as a natural extension of their survival instincts. Fighting was not something humans did by choice. It was something they had been shaped to do by millions of years of evolutionary pressure, Lieutenant. Commander Jake Murphy explained that human military training began in childhood through games and sports that simulated complex tactical situations. Human children learned strategy and teamwork through play activities that other species would consider advanced military education. Their entertainment involved scenarios of survival against overwhelming odds. Tony Martinez showed Zektar examples of human engineering projects that demonstrated their approach to problem solving. When faced with challenges that seemed impossible, humans did not accept defeat. Instead, they developed new technologies and techniques that allowed them to overcome any obstacle. Their history was filled with examples of impossible victories achieved through innovation and determination. The terror that Zektar experienced was not based on human weapons or tactics. It was based on the realization that humans represented a completely different type of intelligence that had evolved under conditions no other known species had survived. They were not simply warriors who had learned to think. They were thinkers who had evolved to survive through warfare. Admiral Johnson demonstrated this point by showing Zektar the coordination systems that humans use to manage their military forces. Every human vessel in the fleet was connected to a communication network that allowed instantaneous sharing of tactical information and strategic analysis. They fought not as individual ships, but as a single organism with distributed intelligence. Dr. Brooks explained that this coordination capability extended throughout human civilization. When Earth colonies were threatened, every human settlement in the galaxy received information about the threat and contributed resources to address it. The species had evolved beyond tribal warfare to achieve coordination on an interstellar scale. The most frightening aspect of human capabilities was demonstrated when General Stone arrived to personally debrief Zektar. The human commander possessed detailed knowledge of Vorthek military doctrine and strategic capabilities that should have been impossible for any outsider to obtain. Human intelligence networks had penetrated the Vorthek Empire so thoroughly that they knew more about Vorthek capabilities than most Vorthek commanders. General Stone explained that humanity had been monitoring galactic civilization for decades and had identified the Vorthek Empire as a threat that needed to be eliminated. The encounter at Jupiter had not been a chance meeting. It had been a carefully orchestrated demonstration designed to break Vorthek military power and send a message to other potentially aggressive species. The message was simple and terrifying in its implications. Humanity had claimed responsibility for maintaining peace throughout the galaxy. Any species that threatened civilian populations or attempted to build aggressive empires would face the same fate that had befallen the Vorthek fleet. There would be no warnings and no second chances. Captain Carter showed Zektar recordings of 17 different species that had already requested peaceful contact with humanity following the battle. The destruction of the Vorthek fleet had not created fear throughout the galaxy. It had created hope among the countless civilizations that had lived in terror of Vorthek expansion. Humanity had become the protector that peaceful species had been hoping to find. The final revelation came when Admiral Johnson offered Zektar a choice that demonstrated the true extent of human strategic thinking. He could return to Vorthek space carrying a complete record of the battle and a detailed explanation of human capabilities. Or he could choose exile and spend the rest of his life studying human civilization as a guest rather than a prisoner. Zektar chose exile because he could not bear the thought of returning to his homeworld with news of what he had witnessed. The Vorthek Empire would collapse not through military defeat, but through the psychological impact of learning what humanity was capable of achieving. His people would realize that they had encountered a species that was evolutionarily superior in every way that mattered for survival. His final log entry, which he transmitted to Vorthek space before accepting permanent exile, contained a warning. that summarized everything he had learned about humanity. They were not conquerors who sought to build empires through force. They were survivors who had evolved to eliminate threats to their continued existence. They had made the galaxy their domain not through conquest, but through the simple demonstration that they possessed the power to defend it against any enemy. The collapse of the Vorthek Empire began within days of receiving Zektar's transmission. 17 star systems that had been held together by fear and military force began to dissolve as conquered species realized that they no longer needed to submit to Vorthek authority. The empire that had taken centuries to build disappeared. Within months, as its foundation of intimidation crumbled, Dr. Brooks later published a scientific analysis of the encounter that became required reading throughout galactic civilization. Her study documented how a single species could achieve dominance not through superior technology or numbers, but through evolutionary advantages that could not be replicated or countered by other forms of life. The galaxy had learned that humans were not just another spacefaring species. They were the culmination of evolutionary pressures that had created the perfect survivors. They possessed intelligence that could adapt to any challenge, determination that could overcome any obstacle, and coordination that could mobilize their entire civilization when threatened. Most importantly, they had demonstrated that mercy could be more terrifying than cruelty when applied by a species that possessed unlimited power to enforce their will. Humanity had chosen to become the guardians of galactic peace, and they possessed both the capability and the determination to fulfill that role regardless of what other species might prefer. The age of conquest and empire building had ended because humanity had evolved beyond such primitive approaches to interstellar relations. They had created a new model for galactic civilization based on cooperation under human protection rather than competition for dominance. Any species that could not adapt to this new reality would simply cease to exist.